Welcome. Thank you for tuning in to Lessons of Vietnam show. I am Bill Dixon, your host. The last series we did was a series on life in a day, kind of what it was like and what the soldier had to go through. Um, Today, we're going to start out with a little different. We're going to be talking about who we fought. But before we get started on that, let's get some details out of the way. This is the Lessons of Vietnam show, telling the story of the Vietnam War and the men and women who served in the United States military. We're going to try to dispel some of the truths, the myths and half truths and so forth. I was in Vietnam in 67 and 68 with 159 Engineer Group. We are broadcast courtesy of Nissan Communications from their worldwide headquarters in Raleigh, North Carolina. If you have any comments or suggestions or whatever, please give me a call or email me at dixonbill80@yahoo.com. If during the show you'd like to come on and make a comment or whatever, you can dial in at 919-518-9773 or come in on Skype at Computers 2K Voice. Either way, you can come in and give us your opinion or comment or whatever, it's something you see. And during this period of time, we're trying to get over COVID. It seems like it's popping up a little bit before. But if you're out there and you're a veteran or a family member of a veteran or a friend of a veteran, and you know they're in a crisis and having a bad time or whatever, don't ignore them. They need somebody to reach out for them. Encourage them to dial 1-800-273-8255 and press 1. If you press 1, you get someone who knows how to talk with veterans out there. It's all confidential. You can text them. And also you can get for the deaf, you can get the special number there. All right, let's get on with the show now. Who did the American military and its allies fight during the Vietnam War? I was in a class. I do a lot of speaking in class, and one day, a young man came up and says, well, all y'all thought was farmers. Well, not quite. But so we're going to get into that. But okay, let's get right on into that next slide. Before the who, we should look at what they fought against. Well, you see a young man there holding a baby. We were trying to help him. We were called baby killers for some reason. There you can see the guy going through the swamp. There's a green two-step snake. Going through the jungles, the tigers, the television war. People had never seen war before and didn't understand war, but they saw it every night during dinner. Spraying of Agent Orange, all the bugs and spiders, the press showing details without the details. Some people had problems with smoking marijuana, and you see the big millipede there. Those are all the things we fought against, as well as the bad guys. Okay. Let's talk about some of the other things we fought about. Unclear objectives. A significant challenge faced by the American military and its allies was being engaged in a war without clear military objections. Amen. There was no front line, no safe area to defend. There was not a well-defined area in which to operate. An area could be cleared of communist soldiers in the morning and the American troops depart, and the area would be back in enemy hands by sundown. If you don't take land and hold it, how do you know winning or losing? Well, somebody come up with the idea of body count. That's leadership selected as a measurement. Body count. You kill more of them in battle than they kill of your troops. That's how you know whether you're winning or losing. Several problems, though, with body counts was a very selective number. The communists took a lot of their bodies with them when they left or retreated to tunnels. So other true body count challenges due to pressure from higher up as well as results of bombing. Sometimes the higher ups would want a body count so bad and give you a hard time you almost had to invent something. The Vietnam War was a 360-degree war. There was really no safe areas. Be it the boonies, fire bases, cities and towns, or large bases where any soldier, particularly American, might encounter attacks, ambushes, and booby traps in any place or time. It was a war where territory changed hands frequently, People moved freely. The enemy and civilian population was very difficult to see a difference, and the loyalties were often unclear. When you went into a village and dealt with the civilian people, you didn't quite know which side they were on. The American public was a problem. Hanoi's goal was to prolong the war for as long as it could while inflicting as many casualties on South Vietnamese and American personnel as they possibly could. Hanoi knew if Americans and its allies' involvement in Vietnam was costly, or that its political and military leaders were impatient, and that the American public would tire of the war and exert great pressure on the elected leadership, where the televised war came in. Weather conditions. Vietnam's subtropical climate, terrain of swamps, rice paddies, hills and mountains, weeds and jungles also took their toll on American troops. The heat, humidity, monsoonal rains, and groundwater meant uniformed GIs were almost constantly drenched with water or sweat, causing sores, infections, and diseases, and uniforms rotting off their bodies in some instances. And of course, you can't leave out nature. Vietnam's extensive wildlife posed its own dangers. American soldiers encountered malarial mosquitoes, leeches, ticks, fire ants, and 30 different kinds of poisonous snakes. It is estimated that between 150 and 300 Americans died in the war from the effects of snake bite, not including bites from bugs and spiders. That millipede you saw a while ago, about 18 inches or so, he wouldn't kill you, but he'd make you very sick. The soldiers, disillusionment and frustration with how the war was being fought with the many insane rules of engagement. Losing friends, taking an area, then leaving, allowing the communists to reoccupy the area, sometimes before the Americans even left the area. The psychological trauma of having seen fellow Americans or allies killed or maimed by sniper fire, mines, or booby traps that offered no opportunity for retaliation or payback. This, with the news of protests, riots, and burning back home, led to questions of their family's safety back in the world while they were engaged in Vietnam in a war. What am I fighting for, and who gives a damn? It don't mean nothing. And of course, the public perception. As a result of the protesters, media sensationalism, lies, and misunderstanding, many of the American public thought of the troops fighting for them in Vietnam were all drugged out of their mind, baby killers, women molesters. The Vietnam War, American fighting force was just a reflection of Americans had never seen a war up close before. But it was the reflection of America. What's going on in America as far as the people was also going on in Vietnam as far as the troops. Again, public perception continued. With short news clips shown without any depth, false narratives were formed. Eddie Adams' photo of Brigadier General Nguyen Ngoc Long of the Saigon Police Department shooting a Viet Cong prisoner is considered one of the most influential images of the Vietnam War. At the time, the image was reprinted around the world and came to be a symbol for many of the brutality and anarchy of the war. Well, you know, war is kind of tough. Eddie Adams apologized to the general many times for taking that photo. What did not go along with the picture was the story behind it. The man was not in a uniform. Under most laws, he was considered a spy to be shot on sight. It was a time of fighting, in some cases, both brother against brother, with a lot of emotion on both sides. The man was captured at a mass grave of Saigon policemen and their families that had been executed by this man. What would you have done in your reaction? It was kind of hard to take a prisoner with what was going on. They burned Vietnamese girl, even though an American went on TV crying how sorry he was for dropping napalm on the girl. He even had a big write-up in Reader's Digest. It was all proving as a lie. No American was involved with the accidental dropping of the napalm on the girl. It was a tragic accident by a South Vietnamese pilot. But you saw from the news, it was like the Americans were out there bombing children ourselves, and it was an accident by the South Vietnamese. News reports of the Battle of Quai Son consistently referred to the struggle as another Dien Bien Phu, where the French were defeated But in reality, the U.S. and South Vietnamese enjoyed a much stronger position than the French. In addition to a fleet of helicopters and cargo planes that could resupply and reinforce the besieged Marines, they could also rely on the heavy bombing capacity of the B-52 fighter planes, which dropped close to 100,000 explosives on the hills surrounding Khe Sanh over the course of the battle. Though U.S. officials expected a full-scale attack by North Vietnamese forces on the base, it never came. And in March, Westmoreland ordered Operation Pegasus, a joint Army Marine in Arvin, Army Republic of Vietnam, ground advance that relieved the base and ended up the siege by mid-April after some 77 days. Now, a news photograph showed the Marines hunkered down like rats in the ground during the siege. But in reality, they fired back more rounds than they received. The number of communist forces killed in the Battle of Khe Sanh would reach around 10,000 compared to fewer than 500 U.S. Marines killed in action. You see the difference with what they showed and what the reality? A Life magazine did a photo article showing the number of Americans that died in a single week in Vietnam. Tragic as it was, in the United States, more people were killed by drunk drivers in that single week. Why didn't they show those people's photos? Or did it not fit their agenda? The Tet Offensive, 1968 Tet. Even though Americans and its allies won a decisive victory over the communists during the Tet 1968 Tet Offensive, in effect, we lost the war. The people of America, due to slanted press reports and the fatigue of fighting a war at home and in Vietnam, turned against the war and the military. They began to blame the troops for the plight in Vietnam as they perceived it, spurred along by the press and political changes. The Viet Cong troops of the communists were virtually eliminated as a fighting unit as a result of initiating the Tet Offensive. Their ranks had to be filled in by North Vietnamese military. Americans and its allies won the battle in Vietnam, but lost the most important battle at home, a battle they had no power in or control. So who did the Americans and allies fight on the ground during the Vietnam War? Who were the enemy soldiers? Even that can be complicated. So many have the misconception that the Americans only fought the farmers by day who became guerrilla fighters by night with primitive weapons. Yes, we did, along with well-trained Viet Cong guerrillas and a hardcore North Vietnamese military that was well-trained and equipped by Russia, China, Cuba, and other communist countries. China's involvement. Despite being in bad economic shape at the time, newly communist China aided Ho Chi Minh during the war with the French and did so again during the war with the Americans, providing weapons, expertise, and manpower. All told, the Chinese claim to have spent over $20 billion in support of North Vietnam and deployed more than 320,000 military personnel, more than 4,000 of them who died. For the most part, the Chinese stayed in the background, rebuilding areas destroyed by U.S. bombs and manning anti-aircraft batteries, but perhaps the biggest role was preemptive. They made it clear that if U.S. ground troops invaded North Vietnam, they would respond in kind. The Soviets' involvement. They actually put more money in than the Chinese. Though it originally took little interest in the Vietnam War, the Soviet Union secretly ramped up its aid to North Vietnam following Nikita Khrushchev's fall from power. The Soviets wanted to make life difficult for the United States, but they didn't want to do it in a way that got them in a conflict with the United States. Kind of like what we've got right now, huh? Soviet involvement in the war increased in the late 1960s, just as China's influence was lessening. The two countries were undergoing a bitter split at the time. That means China and the Soviet Union were not getting along. Among other weapons, the USSR provided surface-to-air missiles that the Chinese weren't yet technically capable of producing. The Soviets even allegedly shot down some U.S. planes. Overall, though, they pumped in only about 3,000 troops in the conflict, far fewer than Chinese, a whole lot more money. So who were the Viet Cong? Like everything else about the Vietnam War and American war in Vietnam, that answer is complicated. Some were just looking for revenge from the South Vietnamese military. Some were conscripted by the Viet Cong from the villages. Then there was the South Vietnamese who felt communism was the solver of all problems. Added to that group was the Vietnamese nationalists who wanted one Vietnam, and that the North and South would come together as one, if it was under communism. And of course, the Vietnamese farmer who could sometimes really did not have a side other than be left alone by both sides, so he would be able to raise his family, tend their rice paddies and water buffaloes. Even the origin of the name VC or Viet Cong, Vietnamese communist, has many variations in its origins. The Viet Cong, officially known as the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, was an armed communist political revolutionary organized in South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, was its military force. This is an article by Brett Riley. He says, by 1948, national newspapers like King Guang began to speak of a new term, Viet Cong. King Kong warned, if this Viet Cong army is about to able to join hands with the Trung Chinese Cong, or Chinese communists, at the Sino-Vietnamese border, then what more can prevent the communization of Vietnam? By the end of 1950s, members of the Viet Minh and Communist Party began an uprising in the South and North Vietnam, resolved to support and lead this Southern uprising. South Vietnam, under the leadership of President Diem, denounced these Viet Cong insurgents, and he is given credit for saying Viet Cong. But when they were split, the countries, a lot of the Viet Cong stayed, or the communists stayed, and some of them went up, but over a million people came south. Activists opposing American involvement in Vietnam said that the Viet Cong was a nationalist insurgency indigenous to the South. They claimed that the Viet Cong was composed of several parties, the People's Revolution Party, the Democratic Party, and the Radical Socialist Party, and that the Viet Cong chairman, Mr. Nguyen Tho, was not a communist. Anti-communists countered that the Viet Cong was merely a front for Hanoi. They said some statements issued by communist leaders in the 1980s and 1990s suggested that the Southern Communist forces were influenced by Hanoi. According to the memoir of, whoever he is, Tran Van Tra, the Viet Cong's top commander and PRG defensive minister, he followed orders issued by the Military Commission of the Party Central Committee in Hanoi, which in turn implemented resolutions of the Politburo. Even though they were kept saying they were independent, Hanoi was giving the orders all the time. More than 430,000 Chinese communists. A while ago it said 330. Now we're saying 430. So it's in that range anyway. Chinese communist troops served in Indochina from 1968 to 73. The Chinese and Russians supplied 95% of materials, food, and medical to the Vietnamese communists. There were Russian troops as well as Cuban troops serving in many capacities for the North Vietnamese communists. Often the Russians would send AK-47s to China to be delivered to North Vietnamese. The Chinese would keep the well-made Russian weapons and send the cheaply made Chinese weapons for AK-47s to North Vietnam. The Chinese communists took part in the war preparation, training, battle planning and execution, tactical decisions, combat problem solving, political indoctrination, and performance evaluation through the Vietnam War, but not got fully involved. International commerce forces, technology, and logistics proved to be the decisive edge that enabled North Vietnam to survive the U.S. Rolling Thunder bombing campaign and help the Viet Cong defeat South Vietnam. The Viet Cong from the Know Your Enemy series and Armed Forces Information and Education. Viet Cong, VC, Victor Charlie, means Vietnamese communists, and they employ the entire arsenal of communist deceit, and violence. A Viet Cong is a man, woman, or child, tough fighters, in what they are taught to call the liberation of South Vietnam, the Republic of Vietnam. As you can see there, the young man with the AK-47. You see the woman there and the men. Everybody got involved. Most of them were conscripted. The National Liberation Front, you can see their flag, the VC flag. Viet Cong also applies to both the military and civilian units of the National Liberation Front. The main force, VC, a lot that came down from North Vietnamese, have weapons supplied by Russia and China. They wore a uniform and sometimes the black pajamas outfit of the VC guerrillas. Remember the farmer in the black pajamas? Well, the Viet Cong coming down sometimes wore black pajamas and sometimes they wore their uniforms. The VC guerrilla units were located in the areas of their village and hamlets. They are armed and have some training. They were dressed in uniform of the peasants, the traditional black pajamas. Their job was to guide, support, reinforce, and provide recruits for the front. Their job is to also enforce the rules of the local front government. The front would be the North Vietnamese National Liberation Front. They operated schools, hospitals, and clothing factories and arsenals. They collected taxes from the peasants to support the front. They governed by secret agents, fear and intimidation. There were some remote areas that were only government around was the Communist Front. The Viet Cong had hidden caches of weapons and ammunition left over from the war with France. They had many trained, dedicated members of the Communists to give leadership and access to the resources of North Vietnam's communist regime. Most of the VC were white farmers, accustomed to hard work and an absolute minimum of material comforts. Their philosophy was essentially fatalistic and undemanding. With the people of both North and South having basically the same racial background, it made it difficult to identify a friend from a foe. North Vietnam sent a steady stream of infiltrators, arms, and supplies into South Vietnam by land and sea. And you can see what we call the Ho Chi Minh Trail there in the map. And they're pushing a bicycle down with a stick down some of the bad trails. The communist regime in North Vietnam directed, controlled, and supplied the entire VC effort in South Vietnam, even though they claimed for years they had nothing to do with it. The Viet Cong forces consisted of two elements, paramilitary and the full military. The paramilitary VC is generally a local civilian who is a part-time soldier or guerrilla whose military duties do not take him or her far from their community. There are two levels of the VC paramilitary guerrillas. First is the old man or woman with little training and is equipped with a primitive weapon who is generally used as a village defender. And I have guerrillas like the guerrilla animal there rather than the gorilla. Second is the combat guerrilla, who is younger and better trained and armed. This person is generally called on to aid guerrilla mobile units or full military units in their operations in the vicinity of their village. They also serve as a manpower source for the VC full military unit. In other words, if they came in and the full military unit needed extra soldiers, they were conscripted to go. The full military unit of the Viet Cong is also divided into two groups. There are the regional forces and the main force, who are self-contained and not uniformed and primarily use guerrilla tactics. They are dependent for most of their logistic support from the local population. The regional forces, sometimes called territorials, are units established by front district committees who supplied their leadership and direction. They primarily operated in one general area. And then the elite of the Liberation Army are the battalions of the main force units. They are sometimes referred to as the hard hats because of the helmet they wear to distinguish them from the regional forces and the paramilitary units. So the military has two different units and the non-military had two different units. I don't know how in the world they kept up with all that thing, but they seem to have done a good job. Who are the cadres? They are trained, dedicated, hardcore communist leaders and military officers. Their jobs were to spread out amongst the villages and hamlets to win support for the communist insurgents. He represented the party in the countryside. And they would come in and take over, and they would set the rules down and so forth. Captain Lamb, a member of the cadres, describes his job. We seek to do three things. The first is to drive a wedge between the people and the South Vietnamese government, to make the people hate their government, America and its allies. Our second objective is to get the people to join the VC forces. The third, persuade them to increase their production and give that increase to the Viet Cong. Propaganda newspaper. The cadres would guide the villagers in forming their own government, but it would be under the party control. Also, they would be led into organizing their own armed forces, which became the auxiliary for the VC. Propagandized every day. The cadre lived in the village or close by. They appealed to the ideals, patriotism, and emotions of each villager according to their situation to try to recruit them for the cause. If a villager is arrested by the South Vietnamese government, the cadre is there as soon as the person is released, sympathizing with them, arousing their hatred of the government, and recruit them. Viet Cong cadre Captain Lamb states that many times he would bring hungry, tired troops into a village so that people could see how the VC were suffering for them, to arouse their sympathy. He goes on to say, we try in every possible way to create hatred for the government and Americans, to separate the people from the government, and to make them see that the VC are their only hope. As the war moved on, the friendly persuasion changed to terror tactics towards the villagers. You've probably heard win hearts and minds. We were trying to do it, and VC was trying to do it for a while, but then they decided, to hell with that, we're going to make you do it anyway. The men, women, and children that make up the civil and military components of the Viet Cong military and its shadow government, the National Front, are as diverse in origin and motivated as any army or government anywhere. The most important thing that sets them apart from their fellow Vietnamese is the way in which they are incessantly told and caused to repeat the reason for everything they do, including supporting the Viet Cong. Here's some stories by Viet Cong recruits. These are Viet Cong that were forced in or drafted, we're going to say, into the war, into the North Vietnam Army, the VC. Sergeant Vo An Long, a 31-year-old squad leader in the Main Force Battalion. I was a farmer until May 1960. The government controlled my village, but the Viet Cong would come in at night and collect taxes. They would tell us, and we believed them, that they were good men who loved and wanted to defend the poor people like us, that they struggled and sacrificed even their lives to give rights to the poor people. Finally, they told me and 5 other young men that if we stayed in the village, the government would take us away for the army, drafted. But if we went with them for a week of training, we could become a local guerrilla and defend our village. Went with them. But then they told me that because of my ability, I must go on to a longer training course. We marched for months to reach the training camp where I studied for 6 months and then was graduated as a squad leader. I soon realized that the life of a Viet Cong was hard. But the cadre kept emphasizing that we were living gloriously, that we must be prepared to die splendidly. Although I knew I had been fooled, I accepted this. We studied and had self-criticism sessions every day. Each of us belonged to a 3-man cell, so that each man was watching by the 2 others. I stayed with them for 4 years, fighting in many battles. Eventually, I could no longer stand being away from my family. And so I ran away and joined the South Vietnamese side, which means he became a Kit Carson's scout. Educated or ignorant, professional soldier, officer, or enlisted, or farm boy, they have all the same story of relentless indoctrination of discipline, playing on every human emotion, constantly applied. The VC are required to memorize basic codes of conduct, a 10-point oath and a 12-point code of discipline. This put the soldier in the position of hero, patriot, friend, and a protector of the people. They are never allowed to forget these roles. The most effective reminder is the daily indoctrination in self-criticism times. The indoctrination is continued and reinforced. The motives are reviewed and discussed by the group, and they are told by the leader what their future action would consist of. Then the VC must confess publicly and criticize their own shortcomings and deeds. After every battle, there was almost immediately critique, with no holds barred, which gave every member a chance to let off steam. It also gave the cadre know what they were thinking. This aided to the effectiveness of the constant surveillance program maintained by the three-man cell. Appeals to the mind and the heart are the principal way in which the Viet Cong sought to its members. Regular units employed standard forms of military courtesy and strict obedience was always expected, but emphasis was placed on making compliance with the regulations appearing to be voluntary. For those who failed their duty, if such normal punishment as public criticism, extra duty, and brief confinement do not reform the penalty, is often discharged in terms of that make the soldier feel like a traitor and outcast from the human race. It has been said that the typical Viet Cong soldier probably was told the reason for everything they did in more detail than any other soldier in the world. Almost certain they were required to explain the reason for their actions more than any soldier. Every proposed action was discussed from all angles before it was taken, and by everyone concerned except the targets and the innocent bystanders. Every detail of the action will be planned out, including when and where the main force units will meet the local force and military units. The militia is always a necessity to guide the troops, provide laborers to carry the supplies and any items collected in the bodies of the dead. They always pull out the bodies of the dead. The VC use of terror was said to be natural as support requirements rose rather than voluntary contributions. Taxes were raised repeatedly. Draftees were necessary to fill in the spots where voluntary recruiting did not meet the needs. Terror and punishment produced the fastest results. As you can see there, the tunnels they had, 3 feet deep. You can see the bedroom and the hammock. They had kitchens, everything in there that some people lived down in those holes almost constantly. So they did suffer. That's a picture of a hospital somewhere in the swamps. Where they got wounded soldiers. If you go through the tunnels of Cu Chi, they show you. This is the mannequins that's in the tunnel. They show you how people lived in the tunnel. That's a couple with a baby supposedly, and that little spot. And for them, they had a cooking area and a bed and so forth for people living in the tunnel. This is one by a former Vietnamese soldier. He says 8 things Vietnam War movies left out. His name was Nguyen Hoa Gia. Even if your knowledge of the Vietnam War comes exclusive from Hollywood films and textbooks, Texan textbooks that only refer to as that one, good guys lost. You probably heard about the Viet Cong. There were a bunch of jungle fighting guerrilla warriors who killed American boys by nighttime ambushes and terrifying traps. Well, that's one side of the story. Here's another. They were a bunch of scared, mostly young kids fighting in a massive conflict for very personal reasons. We sent a writer out to Vietnam to speak with Nguyen Hoa Gia. He follows the Viet Cong from the late 1950s to the end of the war in the mid-70s. Here's what he told us. We weren't all communists. We just wanted independence or revenge. I became a Viet Cong guerrilla in the late 1950s when I was 15. It wasn't because I was a communist or because I ran away to join the circus and just got wildly sidetracked. My uncle actually fought on Ho Chi Minh's side of things during World War II, when the resistance against Japanese occupation was actually funded by the Americans and the Brits. I was just mad at how the South was pushing all of its excess money into the major cities like Saigon. The South Vietnamese government seemed to be ignore small towns and villages like mine. When Diem, leader of South Vietnam, or Diem, leader of South Vietnam at the time, even took away our farms and put them under control of a single rich guy who supported the French in World War II. This happened all over South Vietnam and was called land reform, rather than the far more accurate, serious, deep, and exploratory bombing. The French, who had controlled Vietnam since the 1800s, always saw the locals as lower and were never forgave them for refusing to give us independence. Ho Chi Minh was snubbed twice, and after the second time, he reacted. My uncle also wanted independence and would do anything, including support communism, to get it. Once the fighting started, a lot of people died, well over 1 million on our side alone. For the war to continue, a constant stream of new fighters had to join up, and they didn't have the benefits of such luxuries as functional equipment or the slightest idea of what to do. Over 90% of these new recruits were teenagers or younger. Many of them weren't even particularly invested in the cause itself. They just went along for the ride. Supporting communism or the dream of a united Vietnam was less a motivator than wanting revenge for the death of a parent, loved one, or child. The Viet Cong, literally, the National Liberation Front, or just the front, was just a means of securing that revenge. Most of them were aware that Stalin and Mao each had movements named after them, Stalinism and Mao. So they just assumed socialism was named after a guy named Social, and communism was named after a guy named Communist. A distressing number of my co-soldiers still thought we were fighting the French. They knew of Ho Chi Minh, but only in vague propagandist terms, not the man's actual history. When we told them we wanted a socialist society, they just said yes because they were mostly poor, grieving peasants living through a shortage of dams and thus had none to spare for politics. We were just as scared of the jungle as the Americans were. We were just scared again as the Americans were. The old movies tend to portray the Viet Cong as deadly jungle warriors, blending into the foliage and melting out of the wild to launch continuous surprise assaults on various Rambos. That's all a big load of crap. Many of us, including me, came from border towns and grew up in the hills or the mountains. We had no more mastery over the jungle than a kid from Oregon who has over Death Valley. So the jungle was alien to many of us, and unlike most of the American soldiers, we were stuck spending our entire war there. My uncle and I didn't trust the tunnel systems many of the other VCUs. They were prone to collapse, and if that happened over a barracks or a mess hall, it was likely to kill more people than an air raid. So we did most of our moving around outside under the questionable cover of grass mats. This meant we were not only completely open to rainstorms, but also to murderous animals. It's easy to forget, amid all the drama of war, there were tigers in that jungle. Easy to forget until you met a goddamn tiger, that is. Tigers may be shy, but every once in a while, one of us would disappear in the middle of the night. We'd all just sort of understand why. Tigers don't exactly do end zone dances after every kill, after all. And so many people were killed by snakes. There were also rats as large as cats, mosquitoes, spiders, and centipedes to contend with. While you won't usually die from a centipede bite, one of my co-gorillas committed suicide after being bitten because the pain was so intense. You can see one of them there on the guy's arm. Armed ambulatories give you comparatively good odds of survival. Mother Nature has things uglier than bullets in her arsenal. In other words, being in the jungle with the elements and the animals and so forth was worse than the bullets from American soldiers, according to this man. The fighting looked nothing like the movies. Movies always make the fighting between the Viet Cong and American soldiers look like gruesome, close-up gunfighting. That kind of stuff happened, sure, but only when absolutely everyone screwed up. In reality, even when we were shooting at the enemy, we usually couldn't see them. There'd be muzzle flashes or tracers in the distance, and we'd just fire at those. During more than a decade of fighting, I saw living enemy soldiers up close only 3 times. He fought for more than 10 years and only saw 3 Americans up close. The first time was right after a firefight, and we were shocked to see how blackened the bodies were. We thought they must have been charred by an explosion until we realized their skin was naturally black. None of us had ever seen a black person before. Some people thought they were myths. All of them were either dead or near death. We shot the wounded survivors with a pistol. We were in no condition to provide them with medical care. It seemed kinder than letting them bleed out. We didn't torture them or take any pleasure in their death. The younger guerrillas who were less attuned to death even cried. Thanks to Hollywood, you probably picture the VC as constantly popping out of holes in the ground like deadly gophers. But like I said, before my group avoided those cramped, rickety tunnels full of death traps like cramped, rickety tunnels full of death traps. You don't need an analogy to understand why that sounds like a bad idea. But sometimes we'd have to go really far south, or there'd be exceptionally clear skies, and we decided that the tunnel sounded like marginally more fun than a bomb. The tunnels were essential for a lot of the VC, though especially around Saigon. Unlike living under the mats, tunnel living was a whole different world. Big ones had a kitchen area with the smokestack jutting out sideways so the smoke would billow out far away. There was always rice, usually along with a vegetable or meat, rat or monkey. But as always, the great outdoors was the best bathroom. We generally had to wait for nightfall to relieve ourselves. But if it was an emergency, well, you just kind of hope the bomb hits you direct, so nobody sees that you died squatting with your pants around your ankles. Once in a tunnel of the Laotian border, we even made a fun game. The goal was to be the person who could finish their business outside first. We all got pretty good at this. But once a guy panicked when he heard the distant drone of a plane's engine. He leaped back and in, spraying piss everywhere. It turned out the plane was a North Vietnamese. Everyone laughed except the guy who sprayed us with his pee. He'd been the record holder prior to that point, and now his record was irreparably tarnished with pee. We were the biggest threat to our own safety. On a day-to-day basis, enemy soldiers weren't our biggest threat. We saw more American leaflets and trash piles than actual combatants. My group's job was mainly to observe troops near the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Again, we only got into fights when someone screwed up, but we didn't need any help, Americans or otherwise, to get ourselves killed and mangled. Recruits, undisciplined kids, and given their more responsibility than a Talmadge, which is a hand digital pet that was created in Japan, we'll see to that. In other words, the young kids would panic or whatever. Sure, there was VC training centers, but local recruits rarely attended. Every trained person we go through a camp, 3 more came from the surrounding areas with only the vaguest idea of what a gun was. We provided on-the-job training to our guerrillas, and that led to disaster. I remember teaching one recruit about 17 years old how to throw a grenade. He pulled the pin and asked us what to do next. We were shouting at him to lose it, but he just waved at us and watched the fuse burn up to the shell. It exploded, so did he. Another recruit was given a Chinese AK-47 to stand guard with, and then later that day was asked to cut down a tree branch to give a better visibility for the night. Instead of asking for a saw, he flipped the AK on automatic and proceeded to shoot the branch down. The branch came down, but a bullet ricocheted off and killed him. So we had to bury him as well as find a new position. His shooting had given us away. Our best gear was old junk and usually came from the Americans. Because we're on the front lines of South Vietnam, we were pretty far down the food chain when it came to getting weapons. Some came in through the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but most of those went to the VC outside of Saigon. With the NVA above us and the more critical Viet Cong below us, the guerrillas in the middle got the short bus weapons. It worked like this. The Soviets would make a bunch of AK-47s and send them to China. The Chinese would keep the Russian AK-47s and replace them with inferior knockoffs that they produced. The North Vietnamese army got the Chinese weapons along with whatever World War II era crap they had left over. Since all of those good weapons were, this already bad lot went to the VNVA and VC near major cities. We were mostly wound up with antiques, not even the nice collectible antiques that our old ladies built nests out of, just old. Ironically enough, most of them were originally American-made M1s. I remember the iconic ping and sound, and Thompsons were the norm in the early years. At the fights, there were always enemy M16s scattered about, but we didn't touch those. They never worked right. In one of the few too close infights we had with the Americans, they were actually using AK-47s against us. The American rifles were that bad. Towards the end of America's involvement, we were just getting mortars and mortar shells. The North Vietnamese army was stockpiling everything else for an invasion of the South. In the jungle where we were, fired mortar shells could hit a tree branch and go off prematurely, killing us. So we had to find a way to use them, which required a lot of trial and error. I was in my late 20s by this time and by far the oldest living guy in my squad. So everyone else, all but one, a teenager or younger, asked me to figure out something that would work. As they were training, they were shooting up and killing themselves. What followed was a disastrous slapstick montage. People were physically holding the mortar at chest level and firing horizontal, and then flying backwards from the force of the weapon. We eventually got the idea to tie them onto trees with the backs of the mortar against the trunk. It made one giant 360-degree cannon as long as it wasn't fired with another tree right in front of it. It seemed to work pretty well. And yes, we made traps, including those iconic tiger traps with spikes on the bottom. Those actually were made more with tigers in mind than troops for hope of spearing American GIs. It's right there in the name. Really, seriously. Tigers are terrifying. Our side's war crimes were often glossed over. Whenever Vietnam War crimes are mentioned in the West, people think of My Lai or Agent Orange being dumped over large swaths of forest. Those are both awful things, but for whatever reason, my own side gets to walk away whistling suspiciously. That shouldn't be the case. We committed war crimes on a regular basis. How do I know? I saw them. The North Vietnamese army would purposely target hospitals and medical areas because that was where they could do the most damage. I wouldn't have believed it if somebody had just told me back during the war, but I saw it happen at a base in Quang Tri area and heard the orders given. We were briefly into an NVA area to get new orders. That sounds like what's going on in Russia right now. Excuse me, I can't even read. We were also occasionally called away from the trail to watch over a VC or NVA firefight. Having long-range rifles as support was the effectiveness. But many of us would stop firing when we saw villagers going up in smoke or villagers being shot. The VC and NVA weren't always sure if people near the border were pro or anti-American, so they rather than take chances, they went by the atrocity of them all and let God sort it out or cry it out philosophy. We had kill them all and let God sort it out. No one really survives a war intact. In 1974, with the U.S. out of South Vietnam operations winding down, my VC group was allowed to go home. I took the trails up to my village. As I approached, I started noticing odd things. Signs were gone. No kids came running. No begging. No travelers walked the paths to and from the town. It all seemed too quiet. I remember running up to my village and to find nothing. It was literally all gone. I found only traces of burned village under the dirt. When I went to the hillside outside my village, I saw a new indentation in the land. It wasn't a crater from a bomb, it was a mass grave. And despite knowing what I was going to find, I dug it up. To this day, I have no idea if this North Vietnamese, the Americans, or someone else was responsible. But the way everything was just covered by a bulldozer indicated that North Vietnamese, everyone but my younger brother, was gone. And he would not die until the Chinese War 5 years later. I'm not special. Ask any older Vietnamese person. They all lost many, many loved ones, and not always due to Americans or its allies. I never expected to survive 10 years at the front, and to be honest, I still don't really feel like I survived. Only time and support can heal wounds. After the war, I moved to Saigon. At the point, I never lived in a city and had spent half my life utterly detached from society. All I knew was how to hide, kill, and drill. It came out everywhere I went. I fought people because of the way they were carrying a loaf of bread, because it looked like they were smuggling a radio. I had the bathtub taken out of my apartment and built a custom one out of metal, tarps, and dirt to stimulate bathing in a river. In hip U.S. neighborhoods, they'd call that something like a hello bathing and then charge you for a fortune for it. But I just knew no other way to be. I just had to be reminded constantly to pay for things. Because I was just so used to taking them, I struggled with PTSD and depression and thought a lot about suicide. In a weird way, communism actually helped keep me alive. Workers in unified Vietnam were forced to socialize with each other during the breaks and lunch. That's down to the whole community, part of communism. Lone wolves might have strange ideas. They might not be committed to the party. I started talking with others around me to avoid suspicion and found that, to my surprise, human interaction was some kind of value. Many of them had similar experiences. They lived, but they had lost their family and friends in horrific ways. Over months and years of breaks, lunches, and trade meetings, my group of co-workers turned into a Depression Anonymous support group. Life is much better now. By the 1990s, the U.S., Australia, and South Korea all more or less apologized for their role in the war. Today, the U.S. is actually viewed favorably by over 3/4 of the population. That's because most of them know anything about the war. The general negative feelings are actually aimed more at France and China than the U.S. Since you guys at least apologized, I've personally forgiven the U.S. and everyone else for their involvement in the war. I lost my entire family, but I managed to start a new one with a wife who also lost nearly everyone, including her husband, in the war. I went back to the site of my village a few years ago, and I found it to be a forest. The sunken area within the grave is still there, but there is a small memorial with trees growing over it. It made me feel oddly at peace. Death had been covered by new life. Wow. The American military were fighting a bunch of farmers by day and guerrillas by night. We were up against a group of trained forces that were highly motivated, some for communism, some for nationalism, some due to terrorist threats. They used any and every tactic possible in it to fit their needs. On our next show, we'll talk about the North Vietnamese Army, who were well-trained and armed by Chinese and the Soviet Union. Thank you for tuning in to Lessons of Vietnam. Our past shows are available on YouTube and www.nissancommunications/archives.com. You can go into that and see the archives of the past shows and so forth. I highly recommend, if you didn't see the series of Life in the Day, you go through and see that. Please tell your friends about us. We're out here trying to dispel the myths. A lot of Vietnam veterans have watched the show and talk about how they appreciate it and so forth. So our next show is June 13th. Tune in we'll be talking about the NVA, North Vietnamese Army. These men were, and women, went through training just pretty much like the Americans went through. Only difference was they were fighting at home. They had weapons supplied, all kinds of weapons, tanks. They did have airplanes. They had helicopters. They had tanks. They didn't bring them south a whole lot, but they did have them, and they were up in I Corps. They did fight with them up there. So thank you very much for tuning in, and we really appreciate it, and we'll see you June 13th, and have a good, strong week.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by StreamingGear.com, Carolina Apparel, and DeltaForce.net.